All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to go over the first fallacy of the chapter. So I just call it evil deity fallacy, which, like I said, it's not really at the core of atheist beliefs, but I still wanted to cover it, just to cover my bases. So to go over this first point, it says, the core of atheist beliefs regarding God and the problem of evil is encapsulated by the classic argument of Epicurus, right? And I don't know if I'm saying that right. So he's an ancient Greek philosopher, which I think he's famous for a lot of things. But one of the things he's known for is for an argument against the existence of God. Some people say specifically a religious God, or the way God is generally portrayed in monotheistic religions. But I should have looked up his argument, but it's something to the effect of God cannot be all powerful, all loving, and what was the other one? He can't be all powerful, all loving, and all knowing at the same time, right? And the reason for that, basically according to him, is because of the existence of evil, the existence of suffering, right? If God were all powerful and all knowing, then he should stop the suffering. At least he would if he were all loving. So one of those things basically has to be taken away as far as it relates to describing God in order to describe our current reality. So that's basically, like I said, it's not the core of atheist beliefs, but this is a common argument from atheists, right? Which I believe this argument is complete nonsense, right? And I'm going to demonstrate why I think that, right? So, but it is true, right? If you think about it, a lot of what's a common question atheists have, right, about God? Well, why is there so much suffering? Why does he allow suffering in the world? Why does he allow babies to suffer and, unalive prematurely and things like that, and kids suffer and things like that, right? So, meanwhile, there are people who engage in evil who get away with things, right? Why is all that allowed? God can't possibly exist. So, and then there's the thing about hell, right? So he sends people to hell and this and that. So, like I said, that's a common component of atheist beliefs. Now, there's a much larger answer, right, as to why people suffer and things like that. We're not going to address that in this video. We're going to talk a little more about that much later, probably around chapter 9 and 10. We have to really talk more about the purpose of life. But we're just going to cover it from really just the scope of this kind of simple argument from Epicurus. So to go over this next point, it says, God could simply be evil from the perspective of the atheist. So what do I mean by that? Well, I like to think of it like this. So if you think about the beginning of the universe, right? So at the very, 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 very beginning, right? So there was nothing else, right? The only thing we presume was at the complete beginning was God, right? So if we presume that at the beginning there was just God, I think it's, at least for the atheists, because of the way they think, right? They don't ascribe certain supernatural properties to God, to the existence of God, which that'll make a little more sense based on what we talk about in one of the later videos. But suffice it to say, let's just say in the beginning, right, there wouldn't have been any bias toward a particular state of reality, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is basically in the beginning, you could imagine everything was possible. There were all possibilities were on the table, right? What reason would there have been to have one possible reality or one possible condition or reality versus another, right? This is the very beginning. There's no reason to have a bias toward anything. And so the way I look at it is, if that's true, right? And again, that's a larger, more metaphysical answer as to how that works. But if we take that as true for the moment, then it's perfectly possible for God to be something that the atheist would consider to be evil versus something he would consider to be good, right? Why would this seemingly evil God have more of a preference at the very beginning than the seemingly good God to the atheist, right? What reason should one win over the other, right? This is the very beginning, right? Everything's random, right? There's random chance for everything, at least according to the atheist beliefs. So basically, in other words, God could actually just be a being who the atheists would call evil, right? So he does allow suffering. He does let people who engage in evil get away with stuff, right? The idea that there's suffering does not necessarily mean God doesn't exist, right? Now, of course, the atheist might hear that and say, well, first they'll still say that doesn't prove God's existence, but they will also say that I conceded on Epicurus' point, right? So I said that God might be something they consider evil. Well, that was his point, right? So God could be all loving, all knowing, and all powerful. Well, he can't be all three at the same time. So in this case, he's all powerful and all knowing, but he's not all loving, because I conceded that he might be evil. So his Epicurus' point stands. But no, right? So the answer is actually no, that's not true. That's not what I did, right? That's how an atheist would interpret it. No, I said God might be something that the atheist would consider evil, not that he's actually evil. So God, of course, is all good and all love, right? So how can you square this idea that there is suffering and evil in the world, and how could God be all loving at the same time, right? So to the atheist, at least, it doesn't make any sense. Well, the way I like to think about it is basically, I like to think about it from the perspective of the baby, right? So if you have a baby, right, and the baby's being poked with a needle, so I like to look at it from the perspective of a baby, right? So if you have a baby and a doctor pokes a baby with a needle, and to the baby, the needle hurts, right? And the baby might consider the doctor to be evil, right? Now, I know this is just a baby, but we can imagine that this probably on some level is what's going through the baby's mind, right? The doctor is a bad person because he stuck the baby with the needle. But the baby doesn't understand that the doctor's doing that to protect the baby, right? The doctor's giving a baby a vaccine to ensure that it lives, right? And it lives healthily, and that it's vaccinated against certain pathogens. Now, the baby doesn't understand that what the doctor's doing is actually an expression of love, right? It's not an expression of evil, but to the baby, it might be an expression of evil, right? And so what I'm getting at there is that if we imagine that God was at the beginning of the universe, and we accept that God exists, so this is speaking to the atheist, right? If we presuppose that God does actually exist, it's pretty reasonable to presume, well, at least to most of us, imagine there's still atheists who might not even accept this, right? If they accept God exists, they still wouldn't accept the second fact, right? But I at least imagine a lot of atheists would accept this fact. So if we presume that God does exist, then we can accept that he's probably smarter than us, right? He probably understands more about reality than we do, and he understands more about love and about morality and things like that. And obviously what I'm getting at here is that we are not in a position to say what love is or isn't compared to God, right? God has the absolute reference frame. And what I'm getting at is something could be evil to us, but when we have more information and within the larger, more absolute context of reality, which is what God's perspective represents, from that perspective, what he's doing is an expression of love. Allowing people to suffer, even allowing kids to suffer, is an expression of love in the larger context. Now, it'll even make more sense when we talk about later in chapter 9 and 10. But yeah, so to us, it might look like evil, right? We're the baby, right? Compared to God, we're like the baby. So to us, it might look like an expression of evil, but in the larger context, it's actually love. So this kind of childish argument, which says God cannot be all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving, it presupposes that our definition and our understanding of love is absolute, and that we wouldn't need to appeal to God's definition. It's not like this is comparing the idea of love to someone else's definition. This analysis is directly comparing it to God, the absolute reference frame which has all knowledge. Why would the reference frame that contains all knowledge be inferior to the reference frame which is ours, which is severely lacking in all knowledge? That doesn't make any sense. That's complete nonsense, right? But, it doesn't surprise me that an atheist would come up with that argument. To be fair, I don't know if Epicurus was an atheist, but this is kind of a standard kind of argument that an atheist would make. It basically includes all the normal fallacies atheists usually engage in. But suffice it to say, this argument is garbage, it's nonsense. And I was debating an atheist online about this, and he was trying to argue with me about it. He did what a lot of atheists do. He kept going into the Bible and this and that. I'll talk a little more about those arguments in the next video. But suffice it to say, eventually he conceded exactly what I said because it's true, right? He was trying so hard not to admit it, right? But it's obviously true, right? We obviously don't have the ability to say what's perfectly evil and this and that, or what, we don't have the ability to say what is absolutely evil. Something is perfectly possible for something to look evil to us and not be evil in the larger reference frame. In fact, that happens all the time, right? There have been many times in our lives where we thought someone did something bad and then we realized they actually were doing something good. It only looked bad from our limited reference frame or our limited perspective, right? So this is complete garbage. It's complete nonsense, this argument. So basically that's just the gist, that's the main gist of it. So that's evil deity fallacy, this idea that God just can't simply be someone who the atheist would consider evil. He might actually exist in that form, right? So this idea to say that God must, if he exists, he must sort of fit this sort of random standard of goodness that I've made up in my head, or he can't exist, is nonsense, right? That's a fallacy. So that mainly applies when people say, look at suffering in the world. By the way, God actually tells us why there's suffering and this and that. People, like, we'll talk more about that later. They just ignore that and go based on their own random opinion. So to get to this next point, this is something I kind of wanted to just talk about because this is kind of something else I noticed about atheists. So like I said, I've never understood atheists for my whole life. I never knew how anyone else takes them seriously. I never did. But, as I got older, I realized not only are there relatively large amount of atheists, but people will actually hear them and not think everything they're saying is irrational nonsense, right? That's shocking to me, right? But that actually happens in the world. So I ended up talking to a lot of atheists, debating them, watching their videos, trying to get to the inside of that mind, like how they could possibly believe what they believe. And I fundamentally came up with these ideas, right? So these are kind of the main motivations. Now, there are other motivations to be an atheist, which we're going to talk about in the other videos, right? These are kind of, I was going to say these are pieces of it, right? But it's more an amalgamation of concepts. But they express themselves through these main things in different ways. Let me put it that way. Because I would say these are at the core of atheist beliefs, but it mainly expresses itself in different ways. But I'm just going to go over it in a less specific way here. So, just to go over it, it says, atheism is a belief largely born out of fear. Right? So that is my honest to goodness, that's 100% what I believe. Atheism, the belief of atheism, again, this is a conclusion I've come to from actually talking to them, watching their videos, trying to analyze their beliefs, debating them, right? I've debated lots of them. And what I've come to believe is that it's like you have to generally be afraid of something to be an atheist. You're always acting out of fear in some way, right? Now, what the atheist will say is that they call us theist, which I just call a rational person, right? AKA a normal person, but they use this kind of term theist for us. But they say people believe in God, right? They're just doing it because, has a coping mechanism for the difficulties of life, and, it helps them to sort of accept reality and accept that life isn't fair and sort of try to make meaning out of life because there clearly is no apparent meaning in life. It's clearly pointless. So they just kind of make these things up to kind of help them get by. And they have this idea that, like, people will also believe in God to kind of cope with the fact that there's no afterlife and this and that. Which, again, to me, that is complete nonsense. And I've always believed that's nonsense. Never for 1 second took that argument seriously. I don't take I've never taken any argument from an atheist seriously. But that's just another one that has never made any sense to me. So first of all, right, actually before I say it, some people also say that people try to be good and they try to follow God and this and that because they're afraid of hell, and, man made the concept of religion and all these rules and the concept of hell just to control people, and people only follow God to avoid hell and all this nonsense. So first of all, no one is really afraid of death, because that's they always contextualize it as people are afraid of dying, and that's why they need to find meaning and this and that, right? No. How many people in modern society, right, and I would even say in traditional society, looking at the average, really look like they're really concerned about death? They're really thinking about it. It's like a cornerstone of their attitude, at least as it relates to God. Right? Because if that was their main motivation, I imagine it would probably come out a lot. They would keep thinking about death and about death. And to be fair, Christians and people do. However, they don't do it in a way where I would argue that it's the core of why they're searching for God. There are many people who who 100% believe they're going to heaven. They don't think there's a hell. They don't think there's a chance they're going to go to hell. They believe they're going to go to heaven, and they're happy, right, with that sort of setup. There are many people who believe in God, but it's not that important component of their life. They just live how they live, right? People are not really that afraid of death. You can see it every day in how they behave, the risks they take, the things they do. They're not really concerned about death or hell or judgment or any of that stuff. That's nonsense, right? The atheist is just what they usually do. It's just making up some random nonsense to try to justify their beliefs because their beliefs don't make any sense, right? What the atheist does is they act out of fear, so they project that onto others. They project that other people who believe in God are also acting out of fear because that's what they're doing. So because they do it, it makes sense to them that someone else must be doing the same thing. No, right? Now, are there people who are obsessed with hell and obsessed with pleasing God and not sinning and have OCD related to that stuff and things like that? Of course there are. But I would definitely not say that is the majority, not by a long shot, right? It is a part of the natural order to believe in God. And we're going to talk more about that in the next chapter, what I mean by that and where that comes from. But it is natural to believe in God. It is unnatural not to, right? And what I've learned about atheists is what they generally will do is they have two big fears, right? One fear is that if they imagine themselves or think of themselves as talking to God and having this sort of belief that God is speaking back to them, they're fundamentally afraid that they might be talking to someone that's not there. It makes them feel foolish. It makes them feel like a fool. It makes them feel like they've been had, right? Or they're duping themselves into something, duping themselves into believing something just because they want it to be true or something like that. So ultimately, it's the insecurity. So that fear within the general, I would argue most atheists, right? That fear is so strong, right? That they would rather not have a relationship with God in many cases, not look for him, not try to have a relationship with him or understand him, just because they don't want to put themselves in that position where they feel like they're being made a fool out of, right? They're praying to someone or talking to someone or attributing certain events in their life to someone who might not be there and it's just in their head. They're so afraid of that possibility, right? And so largely part of that fear comes from pride, right? So they just have too much pride to allow themselves to behave in a way that they think is foolish as it relates to God. Now, there's more to explain about that, but we're going to talk about the other components in the next couple of chapters. But they fundamentally have a sense of pride. Now, what is also born out of that pride is a sense of intellectual elitism, right? So a lot of times they will think that people who believe in God are stupid or they're just making it up to cope with the difficulties of reality and they have no evidence and this and that, right? And they will say we're going to talk more about the concept of evidence in the next. That's actually the main thing we're going to talk about in the rest of the chapter. But for now, I'll just say they look at these people who they think are accepting God without any kind of evidence, so it must just be some form of coping. And they'll think that their standard, their intellectual analysis is the more superior one. Everyone else is stupid and not really thinking right. And they're sort of weak-minded because they're just doing stuff to help them cope. And especially people in traditional societies who believed in God. They just didn't have the intelligence we have today. So they put their intelligence on this pedestal, right? And everyone else is kind of lower than them who believe in God. And that's why a lot of times when you see atheists speak, well, there's more to say, but we're going to talk about it later. A lot of times when you hear this atheist speak, you can kind of see this air or this aura of intellectual elitism, right? And a lot of atheists, right, and I've even seen it before, right? There's a lady whose name I forgot. I might put it in the video, but I think I mentioned in one of my later videos. Mention her name. But she even mentioned it, and I'm sure there are many other atheists who became Christian, usually it's Christian, but I want to say atheists who started to believe in God, right? A lot of times they will just admit that, yeah, before I was in a state of intellectual elitism. I felt like I was just better than everyone, right? Which, there's so much more to say about that. We're going to talk about it later, because for that I have to talk about the nature of evidence, right? And that's the main thing I'm going to talk about in pretty much all the videos after this. So yeah, a lot of atheism, in a lot of cases, is born out of fear, right? So, and I should just to be clear, just say it again, basically fear out of praying to someone or talking to someone or attributing causes to someone who probably isn't there. So in your mind, you're just talking to some imaginary person and convincing yourself of it. So they're just so afraid of that, they would just rather not even have a relationship with God if he does exist, just because they don't want to put themselves in that vulnerable position. And then that pride leads to intellectual elitism. In a lot of cases, they will feel they will lose that intellectual high if they humble themselves and accept God. So the second aspect of fear, right, or the second type of fear that atheism is generally born out of is fear of judgment, right? So one thing, for the moment, I'll just say the Bible, right? There's a lot more to say about it, but for the moment, we'll just say a lot of times atheists will look at the Bible and they'll look at these ideas about God, which says that there's a heaven and there's a hell and God judges us if we're not a super good person and this and that. And what they'll say is that most likely, they'll say they don't really like the idea of being judged and being told what to do and this and that. So they'll say most likely that those rules and those ideas were just some ideas made from man. There's no evidence of them, which is not true. We'll address that in next videos. But they'll say there's no evidence of them. It's just created by man to control people, right? But what they're really doing, right, that'll be one of the reasons why they're atheists. But actually, before I go forward, they'll usually say, I'm not going to do that. I think that's just created by man. I'm just going to try to live as a good person, what I think is good, and try to do my best and not really be on it too much, right, about whether I'm being perfect or whatnot. And I'm just going to try to live my best life, right? So that's what an atheist would say. Now, here's the problem with that, right? So it might sound, that doesn't sound too bad, right? But what the atheist is really doing is he's acting out of fear of God having a very high standard, which goes back to this guy, right? It's perfectly possible that God could exist in a state, or he could be a being that requires something of you that you just don't like, right? That could just be the case, right? It doesn't have to be something that fits into your worldview or that you even would willingly accept, right? In other words, God could literally require us to live in a way that is difficult, to live in a way, in other words, God can have a very high standard of us. So not only do we have to develop a relationship with him, we have to discover him in this difficult world, we have to not sin, we have to avoid all these things, 1,000,001 things tempting us and things like that, and we have to do it our whole lives, otherwise he sends us to hell for all eternity, right? Maybe that is what happens, right? Who knows, right? So the atheist will say, no, I don't like that. That makes me uncomfortable. I don't want that to be true. So you know what? I'm just going to say it isn't, right? So in other words, the analysis there is, I'm just going to believe in something I want to be true, not something that is, I want to say makes more sense, right? But to understand that, we'll have to go into the next couple chapters, the next couple videos. But fundamentally, what they're acting more or less in terms of what they just want to be true and what they hope is true, right? They're not taking what might actually be true and just sort of looking at reality and trying to analyze it objectively to see what is true, regardless of whether I want it to be true or not. What can I analyze is probably objectively true about reality? Now, it's always difficult to do that, and there are different methods to do that as it relates to God, which we're going to talk about in later videos. But a lot of times, their analysis, a lot of their analysis about the objective truth of reality is colored, or there's a bias in it that comes from this fear. They just don't want to be held up to the standard of goodness that God has. It's too much for them, right? They like the easy one that they just make up in their head about morality. That, of course, always leads to negative outcomes, right? Which you see in society. We'll talk more about that in chapter 10. But they fundamentally, atheism is born out of the fear of God's judgment, the fear of God's standard of what it means to have a good life, right? It's too much for them. It's too much work. They would rather just make up their own standard, which is what every evil person does. All dictators and evil people, they all make up their own standard, just like the atheist is. It's no different, right? But they'll make up their own standard and just call themselves good by that standard, and now they're a good person, and it's so much easier, right? So that's one of the other fears that you would generally have when you're an atheist. Or that fear would cause you to become an atheist. That's one of them. And then the last one is fear of work, right? Or in other words, laziness. So again, I don't want to be condescending or derisive or mean or whatever. But like I said, I didn't believe in any of these. I didn't know any of these things. I didn't really have beliefs about any of these things until I actually started talking to atheists, debating them, watching their videos, right? And when I really got inside the mind of an atheist, they still don't make sense to me, but when I really got inside their mind, that's when I realized this was the case. I don't know if I mentioned in the last video, there was one guy I was debating online on Reddit who he was saying things that really led me, it's like it was epiphany. I was like, oh, that's why they believe what they believe, right? And just to say it, a lot of times to me, this is my opinion, right? A lot of times atheists, they're just lazy, right? They're lazy when it comes to sort of finding God. Now, I know what atheists will say. They tell it to me all the time, right? So like I said before, I've debated so many of them, and they have these same arguments over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So I've heard this a million times. They'll say, oh, because I'll say certain things to them, which I haven't gotten to all the arguments yet, but I'll say certain things to them about how to find God and things like that. And they'll say, oh, that's not true, because there are plenty of people who were former religious people or former Christians, then they became atheists. They searched for God for years. Some of them were pastors and this and that, and then they became atheists. So just talking about in this case, how could you possibly say they didn't work hard enough or they didn't do this? So first of all, you can be lazy in different ways, right? A person could be and I've seen this, right? A person could be lazy in the sense that they're willing to work really, really, really hard physically, but they're not willing to work hard in terms of planning, in terms of sort of bettering their mind, right? Reading things and having more of an intellectual, intellectual sort of sound, it's just an ability to, in other words, I should say, they're not always willing to put in the work to learning more, to develop their skills so they can plan their future in certain ways and things like that, because that's a certain type of work, right? It's a lot easier to just sort of get certain jobs, not really think about it too much. Some people have that skill, right? Now there's some people who it's just not, they weren't really born that way. And I get it, right? But some people do have that skill. And they're very bright, but they would rather, right, not work intellectually and just do those types of jobs, right? So you can be lazy in one way and not the other. And it could also be the reverse, right? There are many people who are very bright and they're very intellectual, and they could have more of an intellectual job, but they're very lazy when it comes to physical work. They just don't want to do it. But they're hardworking when it comes to learning and studying and things like that. So you can be lazy in different ways. You can be hardworking in one way and lazy in another, right? And so when it comes to the atheists, they're hardworking in one particular way. So many, and again, I'm talking about the hard atheists, not the soft atheists. So yeah, they do study a lot about God and a lot about spiritual experiences. In many cases, they were formerly religious people and they did try to find God and they were in the church and donating and things like that, right? But they're still lazy in a different way. And that's what they don't realize, right? Now, to explain that, we'll have to talk about how to know God and things like that, that's pretty much all of chapter 4. Well, chapter 3 and 4. Then we're going to go over it again in chapter 10 in a slightly more expanded context. But there's more involved in finding God than just sort of going through the motions with work like that, right? God, and I'll talk about this later, but God requires us to work to know Him, right? I call it, there's more to it than that, but it's under the umbrella term I refer to as spiritual responsibility, which we're going to talk about later. But it takes work to find God. It is part of the purpose. It is really the main purpose of life, right? It wouldn't be much of a purpose if it was easy to do, right? It takes work to know God. You have to work at it, right? And a lot of people, they don't like that He requires them to work like that. A lot of atheists, they would rather Him just sort of show Himself immediately so they don't have to do anything to know Him, right? No, that isn't how it works. And so, a lot of times what they'll do, because it involves so much work, they'll just sort of check out because they don't feel like doing it anymore, and then they just become lazy, right? And so, now, somebody might say, well, what you're saying is a tautology, right? So, I don't know if I mentioned in the previous videos, a tautology is basically a statement that is almost automatically true by definition, right? So it's like similar to begging the question fallacy. So I could say the blue sky is blue, right? So obviously that's a tautology, right? If it's a blue sky, obviously it was going to be blue. So a tautology is something that's basically automatically true, right? So what the atheist might say with that, what I said is a tautology, right? So they could say that, well, if you're saying that it takes work to know God, and you're attributing anyone who didn't find him to sort of just not working hard enough, then basically it's an unfalsifiable claim, right? Because the claim is that if you work hard enough, or if you do a certain amount of work, you'll know God, right? And so I can always say if they don't know God, they didn't do enough work, and if they do know God, then they did the work, right? Which that's actually true, right? But what the atheist is not acknowledging is that unlike them, I'm using a different epistemology for setting up my claim, different from them. So we're going to talk more about that in later videos, right? In the video, well, really after this video. But what I would also say to them is that they're also engaging in a tautology, an unfalsifiable claim. As I was talking to an atheist about this, so I was telling him how it takes work to find God, and there's certain things you need to do before God will reveal himself to you, right? And you see that over and over and over and over and over again from people who say they discovered God. But so my theory actually makes predictions, which we'll talk about that later. But I was talking to him, and he was saying how he knew of this pastor who believed in God for many years and then became an atheist. And I was like, okay, yes, but, so in other words, he's saying that to say that, like, you know, it was all in his head the whole time and he just admitted it to himself, right? And I'm like, maybe you know someone like that, yes, but notice what you're not doing. Notice what you're not acknowledging. That there are also many people who searched for God and found him, right? Including atheists, right? And they don't go back. They're all on fire for God, and they know God, and they claim to speak to God and the Holy Spirit and things like that. Notice in your analysis that those people don't count, right? If someone did work really hard and did find God and is preaching the gospel, right? They're just delusional and they're making it up in their minds, right? If someone searched for God and didn't find him and became an atheist, they're the logical ones and they set the standard for everyone. No, right? That doesn't make any sense. So the reason my claim is not a tautology, theirs is, but mine isn't, because I'm going to set up the proper epistemology for knowing God in the later chapters. But yeah, so I just wanted to bring that up. But fundamentally, what I believe is that atheism a lot of times is born out of laziness. Like another example is how atheists will see a lot of these sort of, they'll see spiritual experiences and near-death experiences and things like that. There will be many things they cannot explain, obviously, right? Because we live in a metaphysical reality, a physical and metaphysical reality. They usually believe there's just the physical. So there's all these things they can't possibly explain. And we're going to talk more about that stuff later. I won't go into it now. But suffice it to say, when they see all this stuff they can't explain, they're just like, you know what? If I admit to myself that looking at these things I can't explain probably means that there's more to life than I'm saying, and it probably means there's a God, then it would mean that I have to do work to know that God and to see if he really has this standard for me. And I would also have to do work in getting past this feeling of pride and humbling myself before God, which is a requirement. But man, that's just too much work. I don't feel like doing it. It's so much easier just to put this experience in this box. If a person says this happened, I'll just say it didn't happen for some reason. They hallucinated or imagined it or something, right? And anything I can't explain, I'll just say, oh, science is still figuring out, and we'll find out one day. And that's basically how they handle all those situations they can't explain. And then they just kind of go right back to their sort of comfortable position, right? And again, it'll make a little more sense because there is a proper epistemology to approaching God, which they're not using, and they don't use that epistemology largely, I think, just because they're lazy, right? So yeah, again, that's pretty much it. There's more to say, but it's just, though I'll have to get into that stuff in later videos. But that is what I fundamentally believe. Again, not trying to be insulting. I've talked to atheists, and that's what the conclusion I've come to, and I believe in the next couple of videos, when I lay out a lot of the fallacies in their logic, you're going to also kind of see that, yeah, they're kind of lazy. It's kind of a lazy way of thinking, right? And when you hopefully, for the person watching this, I don't know how many people are going to watch any of these videos, but for the person watching this somewhere out there, when you have a relationship with God and when you start to know God in terms of the metaphysical concepts I'm going to talk about in all the rest of the chapters, I believe you're going to see like, oh, this path to knowing God was always available and God was telling us the whole time, right? But I just didn't see it. And then you're going to really look at the way an atheist thinks. You're going to see, yeah, if there wasn't this kind of lazy attitude, they would have figured it out, right? but that laziness holds them back. So, because like I said, it takes work to know God. And another tautology I'll just mention is that if it takes work to know God, obviously it's going to be true that some people are, no matter how much they work, just aren't going to find Him, right? Now, I shouldn't mention it like that. There are going to be some people who put in a lot of work and they felt it was enough, or they felt they did it in the right way, so they're just going to give up. In other words, you're not going to know God just from doing what you think is work in and of itself. No, there's certain type of work you have to do. There's certain metrics you have to sort of pass, right? You have to work in a specific way, right? If I'm at a job and I have to work hard at the job, but work hard doing a particular task, and I decide to work hard doing some other task that they didn't ask me to do, it's not like I'm going to still get points and I go say I'm a good worker. No, I'm a terrible worker, right? I didn't do what I was asked to do. It doesn't matter that I worked hard, right? That's how God is, right? If you can work really hard to know God, but if you're not doing it the right way, you're not going to know Him, right? And that's what I mean by there's different types of laziness, right? Atheist is usually lazy when it comes to doing it in the right way. But as far as the tautology, if you have to work very hard in a specific way to know God, of course it's going to be true that there are just going to be some people who just give up because no matter how much work they felt like they were doing, they didn't find Him. So it's always a tautology that there'll be people who worked really hard to find God and then became an atheist. But it's also true that there are many people who worked really hard to find God and then found Him. Right? So when you hear atheists try to use that little sort of trick, which is what I consider it to be, that little sort of debate trick or argument, trick is in the form of an argument, that, oh, look at all these people who used to believe and they used to be pastors and this and that, and they became atheists. They must have done it because they realized that was the truth. No, right? By the way, you can just flip it and say, what about all the atheists who did find God and now they believe? Oh, well, now they're just imagining it. They were smart before, but now they're just imagining it as in their head. Nonsense, right? So it's a tautology and unfalsifiable claim. Now, to the way you would generally test these claims, and that is difficult to do, which I'll concede, but I will set up the epistemology that I believe to be true in knowing God, and you can verify it for yourself, as you go through the chapters. So that's pretty much it. Those are just some topics I wanted to cover in this video. In the next video, we're really now going to move on to what I think is mainly at the core of atheist beliefs, right? This is part of the core, but I kind of went over it in a more sort of overall kind of way. Excuse me. And in the next video, we're going to sort of get to the nitty-gritty. Because what do atheists always say? What's the main thing they'll say when it relates to God? They'll say there's no evidence of God, right? So that's the main thing they'll say, which isn't true at all, right? But that's what we're now going to start breaking down their main claims they have when it comes to again, not a soft atheist, so this is the hard atheist, who would say there is no God and we're certain that God doesn't exist. So we're going to cover that in the next video. But that's it for now, though. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.